Thank you very much. Yes, so I'm going to be talking about digital creativity in newsrooms in the form of a new tool that we've developed called Inject. It's been developed by an interdisciplinary team of computer scientists, designers and journalists, and we have a large author list, and I'm Neil Maiden here today. So really we developed this tool to seek to support and maintain original journalism. So why are we doing this? To some people this seems surprising. Journalism is one of the creative industries. Most journalists perceive their work to be creative. They often become journalists because it gives them a chance to practice their creative skills. And there's evidence that journalists go on to continue to seek creative skills during their career. However, most people in this room are probably now aware that we're probably in the second decade of a crisis in journalism where there have been falling circulations, reducing revenues. And the ultimate implication of this is the unit of resource that's available in terms of time and journalists to produce each news article in a newsroom has fallen. And many of the journalists we spoke to in the development of this project have to write up to about 10 articles a day from scratch, which have about 30 minutes. So really you have issues here about maintaining original and creative journalism. Different news organisations and newsrooms have attempted different strategies to combat this decline in the unit of resource and creativity, but no one, as far as we're concerned, has identified digital creativity support that have been developed for other disciplines and domains for journalism. So what we set about to do 2 years ago was to develop new digital support to enhance journalism creativity so that the readers of the work that's produced by journalists have stories with new angles that are still useful to them, that the journalists use new or enhanced creative skills in the production of these stories, and all of this happens more productively than at the moment. So we're trying to get that sort of intersection of both enhanced creativity and journalism. So pretty much over the last 18 months we've been engaged in a long-running user-centered design process, primarily with, but also sometimes involving co-design with journalists. The process started out with a range of semi-structured interviews to identify problems, requirements and constraints, and then once some of the key design ideas emerged, we moved quite quickly into paper prototyping, digital wireframes, different forms of functional prototype that enabled us to explore the usability of the concepts, and pretty much since about June of last year we've had functional prototypes operating with working journalists and in newsrooms, enabling us to enhance and improve through various long-term formative evaluations. One of the key requirements that came out from the journalists very early on, and this makes sense when you think you may only have half an hour to write a story of 300 words, is that no new tools. Whatever they want is not another application or another window on the desktop. That was rammed home very early on. So the key idea that emerged, which was supported by a lot of the journalists we're working with, was the idea of the Inject sidebar that would typically appear on the right-hand side of whichever work tool, text editor or CMS you might be working in. And it kind of looks like you can see it here on the right hand side in the modern version, and you can see more screenshots in the paper. So for example, if I'm a journalist and I'm writing about the summer Italian migration crisis that happens in the Mediterranean, and I'm writing this piece in Google Docs, I can request through the add-on feature that's already there within Google Docs to have the sidebar appear beside me, and there is interaction between the text that I'm writing in my story and the creative guidance that's appearing on the right-hand side. So we're talking about an embedded sidebar within different work tools. So we took inspiration from the add-on sidebar feature that was in Google Docs and then applied it to other platforms. So it's a fixed 300 pixel width, but it's obviously scrollable, and that's how we're able to fit as much creative guidance for journalists into one sidebar. Has a number of standard features in whichever platform you're working in. You can enter the particular topics which are the focus of your interest in creative angles. There are a number of icons which indicate predefined creative angles that you might want to explore around a story, which derive from interviews with experienced journalists about the angles that they use when they're writing. You've got the creative advice or guidance that the tool is providing back to you as you write. And then we make heavy use of mouse hover over features to squeeze as much creative advice and information into the small sidebar as we can. So I've got a little video here that runs for about 2 minutes, 3 minutes I think, and this will just give you an idea of what it, what it does. cannot believe I cannot get that to run. That worked before. Sometimes I think I need my glasses to make this work. There we go. I do need my glasses to make this work. So let's imagine you're writing an article about the recent Italian election, which we still don't really have an answer for. You can invoke the add-on sidebar quickly just through the standard Google Docs add-on feature, and the sidebar appears next to you. You can highlight any piece of text you've already written, and the tool will do some automatic parsing and insert some of the text already there that you can then control. So we can get rid of some of the text and just work with Italy or Italian and election. We can then browse different predefined creative angles I might want to explore around that story. And in this case, we'll use the one that's called backing and evidence, which means let's look at some of the numbers and the background to the Italian election, because that might give me an angle on the story. So the sidebar pops up. It gives you advice about where some of the data's come from. It's from news language in English over the last year. And then we can quickly scroll down through what we call information or news tiles, which you can see. Some of them describe an existing publication that's appeared in a selected news article that's already related to your story in some way. There are also other kinds of cards I'll talk about before. And as you can see, as the mouse hovers over, it might not be visible here, but it's unfortunately due to the nature of the sidebar, it's giving you different creative advice about think about this and think about that. Underneath these news items, you see there are the colored icons. And what the engine also does is extract different types of entity from the news article and uses those different kinds of entities in order to provide you with specific creative advice. So somewhere in this it will talk about Forza Italia. Think about the background of Forza Italia. There's one in there that talks about the kingmaker, which is kind of interesting. Of course, the kingmaker in Italian politics is still seen to be Silvio Berlusconi. And you can scroll up and down here. You can see I'm flicking over various different pull-ups. You can scroll down. One of the other features I should add is that I'm not going to show in this, that you can actually use a feature to flip the card. So the cards literally turn around in the interface and you get more interesting information such as word clouds and the ability to do drill down Google searches within the tool if you want more detailed information. You can also click on the original articles. So there's the fine man Silvio, published I think in the Irish Independent. And so on. You can also click another strategy, which is around people. Let's explore different people associated with the story. And you get the same structure, but this time it pulls out key people. So here you have Emma Bonino, who's a star of the Italian left over many decades. You have Marine Le Pen. We'll move on. And I think it's an interesting one that came up here. Roger Bannister is promoted. Now, he's an athlete from the 1950s, the first man to run the 4-minute mile. So it's interesting. It's throwing up oddballs here. Is there an athletics view, a sports view on this? Could you take that kind of angle? And you can scroll down. You see probably some more common names here related to some of the stories that are being presented. And down at the bottom, you've got Ivanka Trump. So is there something around the Trump involvement in the Italian election, the relationships between Italian parties, Putin's Russia and America? And then finally, there's another angle, which is around quirky, and the tool throws back digital political cartoons at you that may be used as inspiration as well. So I'm conscious about time, so I'll just move on. So the tool is designed with a standard 3-tier architecture. You've seen the interaction layer. The data layer for the engine is primarily based on indexing. At the moment, we have an index of over 5 million news stories that are generated dynamically and are being generated actually while I'm giving this talk, selected from over 300 news sources that we have chosen as the editorial team within Inject. So we tend not to use tabloids, and we avoid some of the more Breitbarts and where you may have questions over editorial choice. We also have a database from one of our project partners of over 50,000 political cartoons that's been updated daily, and we also use some Wikipedia content. So where does all that come from? We have a service that's basically polling these 300 different news sources every half hour using public RSS feeds, and whenever there's a new article that's been published in that half hour, we produce a rich index of it that enables us to do different kinds of creative search. We do the entity extraction, and we're also loading up other kinds of analyses such as sentiment analysis on the news story, although we're not doing that in terms of presentation at the moment, but we're designing for it in the future. And then once you've built up these indexes, we then undertake creative search. So when a journalist puts in information such as about Italian election, we'll then use some reasonably advanced information retrieval engines against the index. We'll do term disambiguation. We'll understand what kind of election that might be and assign meanings to it. And then based on that sense making and meaning, we'll do various forms of query expansion. So we actually are able to retrieve news articles and information about people that are not directly syntactically related to the text that you put in. And then we filter within different angles. So, for example, if you're interested in writing a longer story, a long read, a causal story, then we'll only choose, or exploring news that's based in a causal angle, we'll only retrieve particular types of publications from particular news organizations. So, other features that we've added as part of the user-centered design, as you probably guessed, I'm from Europe, and not all the journalists in Europe write in English. This was a shock to some of us. So one of the requirements was multi-language support. So not only does the interaction provide feedback and guidance, creativity support in different languages, it also manipulates news that's been written in different languages. So almost half of the 300 plus news sources are non-English sources. So you can see here there's an example about talking about the Trump election and creativity support that's been guided in German based on a German publication. And similarly here, you can go back to the Italian migration crisis story, receiving creative guidance in Norwegian based on a Norwegian publication. So currently the tool is operating in 6 different languages, and we've designed all the interactions and the translations. And a feature that's coming quite soon is that we're able to search, for example, Italian publications and present the feedback back to an English journalist in English to give them useful insights. The other interesting requirement that emerged during the project that we hadn't actually considered was the idea of smart archives. Now, many news organizations we've worked with have actually developed their own news archive, simply the repository of stories that their journalists write every day. Many news organizations really don't have smart technology to get at them. So they asked, could we use those archives as part of the data layer on top of the 5 million plus stories? So we did that, and we've taken a shared archive shared by 3 Norwegian newspapers over 3 years, and we've also plugged that into the tool. So in the last few minutes, I'm just going to run through, well, what's happened. Pretty much the tool was put out there last summer. And, you know, if you know the KAI deadlines, we wrote the paper in early September. So I'm only going to stick to what happened in those early months. You can follow up on our website for all the other really juicy stuff. So in the 3 Norwegian regional newspapers, some of their journalists used the tool for about a month, and we interviewed them when they'd written the first handful of stories. Most were able to, well, all were able to discover angles on news stories that they considered novel to themselves based on the tool, and there were no major usability problems. They tended to use Inject to think creatively about longer articles. So Dog Bites Man is not really a story they use this kind of thing for, but if they're writing something that's more in depth, that's where the tool has use. They prefer to use their own local news information, so they'd rather use something about a moose hunt that happened in Norway, if they're writing about moose hunts, and yes, they do write about moose hunts, rather than, say, a tiger hunt in India. So there's an interesting issue about semantic distance and the information that's presented. And we noticed often they were coming up with new angles very quickly, typically within 3 minutes, which we think is a good thing, but it made us wonder about the extent to which they're really using creativity skills that we were hoping the tool would enhance. And indeed, when we interviewed them, they said they wish we had more journalists to talk about creativity and the use of the tool in the newsroom. In parallel, we had the tool placed into a digital news organization within the UK, and we found similar results. But in addition, there was an interesting piece of feedback around, well, just having the sidebar there changed my behavior, regardless of its functionality. So simply having this reminder to think creatively, one journalist reported that she thought creatively after writing each paragraph rather than just at the end of the article. So there's a kind of sort of jokey implication there. If we just made a screenshot and stuck it on the side of the tool, it might still have had an effect. But I think this is an important issue about how you embed this support. I'll go quickly down to the bottom. There was some negatives, and one of the ones that we've encountered quite a lot is the expectations set by Google Search. Journalists use Google Search all the time, and it has become such a normalized expectation that they find the right thing, the right piece of information straight away. They don't really have to think. Now, our tool is designed to actually encourage them to think creatively. So there have been some issues around trying to reduce the expectation on Google Search, set by Google Search, and that's tied into how we foster creativity. So in my last 2 minutes, I'm just going to talk briefly about what we've done to try and overcome some of these problems. A lot of the work that's gone on over the last 6 months is to try and reduce similarities to Google search. You can sort of see in the background there's a much more multi-layered tiled format that looks less like Google search, which has come about in the tool. We also provide creative advice that's not specific to pieces of news. So Google presents you with a piece of news, a published piece of news, a published piece of news. And what we've decided to do is to embed these other styles of card that don't relate to individual pieces of news but abstract above it to see whether that reduces the similarities. We've also developed a set of manual creativity techniques they can use alongside the tool as part of the training and use. And we've also designed some workflows that we can embed into the organization. So what's happened since, just to give you a heads up, we have undertaken a far more systematic evaluation in those 3 Norwegian newsrooms where they've been using, 4 journalists in each of the newsrooms has been using the tool for 4 months systematically, and we've been comparing both what they did in terms of the behavior and the outcomes in terms of the articles written with Inject to articles written without Inject, and we'll kind of do a novelty and usefulness assessment, classic creativity assessment method on those outcomes. We've also developed simpler entry points into the tool, so there's now an Inject MOOC that will be open for journalists with a training course and access to tool and skills. We are refining these creativity skills that we're giving to journalists, and it sounds kind of strange to give simple creativity techniques to journalists, but there is a gap there. We didn't expect this, but there is a gap there that we've almost backed up from the tool in order to fill that gap. And we're getting a lot of interest from news organizations. So my last point, just as I'm told to stop, is next month we start the use of the tool in a magazine in Germany called Geo, which is a bit like National Geographic in German, which we're launching with a workshop. And that's indicative of the kind of magazine longer read market that we think this tool has the best current potential for. That should give 3 minutes and 45 seconds for questions.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. That was really interesting. I have a couple questions. One of the things that you said was that you noticed that people were using this more for the longer features instead of the shorter ones, and it seems to me that the longer ones generally have longer deadlines as well. Mm-hmm. And part of the point of doing this was to help these journalists who are in a situation where they've got to write 10 articles a day or something like that. So I'm wondering if you think that that's really fulfilling the need that you set out to fulfill. And I'm also wondering how this impacts the accuracy values of news reporting, kind of simultaneously, because speed and accuracy are, I think, very related to each other.
No, that's a fair point. Now, I can report data. We have got some data coming from the longer study, and actually the majority of news articles they've written in that 4-month study in those 3 newsrooms are short news articles rather than features. So the initial reporting, maybe as they become more skilled with the tool, they found ways to use it in shorter articles. So there may be a learning curve there, but we just haven't managed to dig into that data. I just had a spreadsheet of types of articles last week. Accuracy is a good one. This tool is not going to boil the ocean. We wrote the proposal for this project before Brexit and before Trump, and before fake news became common parlance in everyday language. And so I think we've started to explore ways of embedding this tool with fact checkers and other things. So I'm very clear. Our role is creativity, original journalism, but it's developed in an architecture that makes it open to embed fact checkers. So that's my get-out answer to that, Esther.
Absolutely, yeah. I love that. I just think it's also just a super important consideration, because sometimes increasing creativity can increase a little bit of aberrance or a little bit of divergence from actual truth as well.
Sure.
So.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello.
Hi, I'm Corey Fackleris. I'm from Carnegie Mellon University. I'm also a former journalist and news technology analyst. I love your tool. But I do wonder, have you guys thought at all about the implications of creating even better productivity tools that might enable more cutting of journalist headcount at news organizations around the world? And I say that because just that's the underlying condition that's creating the manic production requirements, such as 10 articles per day, which I think everybody can realize is somewhat insane.
So are you arguing that our tool may have an
unintended consequence? Yeah.
Well, that was what we were afraid of early on when we were showing it to journalists, and that has not been the response. And in fact, they see that this can be enhancing the quality of both their own skills and a means of improving the quality of the output. So we haven't had enormous rejections from that point of view. There are interesting tensions between the management of some of these newspapers who want one thing from the tool and the journalists who want another. And I think there's an interesting tension within news organizations that our tool acts as a kind of intervention to stimulate that discussion. But I agree with you. I think this tool has to be part of a much wider change within news organizations. I mean, this is not going to solve all the problems.
But it's wonderful for individuals, yeah.
Yeah, it is. Thank you.